Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy. As promised, we are back revisiting our previous discussion on lupus and looking at this unusual discrepancy between the rates of lupus in the United States and Jamaica and the rates of lupus in Western Africa. And so we are going to be looking at another anomaly related to the rates of lupus in South Africa. And so there has historically been a question about why there has not been a significant number of lupus cases in West Africa, given the fact that the individuals who were transported in the transatlantic slave trade came from those coasts in West Africa. And so we're going to actually look at why this discrepancy may be the case, even when you're considering that the individuals came out of the west coast of Africa. And we're also going to look at some genetic information that might help to uncover why these rates are at variance. For this analysis, we are going to look at a research article looking at these rates of lupus in America versus the rates of lupus in Africa. One of the things that the authors noted is that not only are the rates of lupus for those who've been classified as African American higher than their quote unquote Caucasian counterparts, the rates of lupus are also higher than those who are on the west coast of Africa. Now, the reason why this is so important is that lupus tends to be thought of as having genetic components to it. And so because of that, there would be an expectation that you would see a prevalence for one of these groups from which those identified as African American would be presumably coming from. And so you don't have that. And so it brings up the question then about ancestry. While researchers have been so focused on the west coast of Africa, there has been a neglecting of individuals in other parts of Africa when doing comparisons and contrasts with those who are identified as African American. And this has been a great disadvantage in terms of science. And so a lot of things that need to be considered have actually been overlooked because there has been this insistent focus on West Africa in terms of trying to understand health, genetic makeup of those who are in the Americas. While researchers have noted that lupus in West Africa is rare, what they have noted is that Zimbabwe and South Africa have reported increased numbers in terms of lupus. There has also been additional research that is coming out of West Africa that is attempting to show more of a correlation between West Africa and the United States in terms of cases of lupus, but they have had an extremely long period of time to create this relationship, and that has not been forthcoming. And so they are working diligently to create this relationship. However, this relationship is a little bit more obvious on the surface when you look at South Africa. So we're going to be looking at this epidemiology article related to systemic lupus in populations of African ancestry. This chart is great because it gives you a visual aid and you can actually see the discrepancies in terms of these numbers. And if you look on the screen, you can see that the numbers in South Africa are relatively high in contrast with the numbers in the rest of Africa. And so you can see that for South Africa, there were 287 cases of lupus. And then above that, you can see 71 cases of lupus in Zimbabwe. And then next, you have the next largest number you see in Uganda. And you see a pretty low number for Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, Nigeria, Guinea. And so those numbers are very low. compared to South Africa. And so the only other place on this chart that you see numbers that are similar to South Africa are in the United States, and specifically Maryland. And you can see down below, you also see numbers that are high in the Caribbean. You see higher numbers in New York, lower numbers in California, then going back up to some higher numbers in Pennsylvania. And then you see some relatively high numbers in the United Kingdom. And so one of the things to make note of is that there is this discrepancy even in Africa. But you then see this bizarre correlation between South Africa and the United States. We're going to look at why this might be the case. One of the reasons why data may not be as reliable as it should be in terms of history is that historians have long believed that what was most important with respect to the transatlantic slave trade was focusing more on who sold individuals into slavery versus where the individuals actually came from. And so there has been this focus on the west coast of Africa, along with this historic presumption that the individuals actually came from the west coast of Africa. And so individuals were selling family members and tribal members. That was always the assumption. But as more information is coming out, you are seeing all sorts of dynamics that suggest that individuals came from other places and that they were trafficked from those other places by those individuals who were on the west coast of Africa, along with other Europeans. And of course, not only did you have other Europeans participating in this, you also have the Arab trans-Saharan slave trade going on that is adding to this dynamic. One of the things that the researchers point out is the fact that the individuals who came into South Carolina and the southeastern areas of the United States, those individuals tended to come from individuals who would be considered Bantu. And so that area of Africa known as the Angola region. And the other thing that they've noted is that there is a strong similarity between the Bantu cultures, those language cultures, and the cultures that were seeded in the Americas with individuals identified as African American. There is also a notation that there is a predominance, there's a genetic predominance in individuals classified as African American that is presumed to be Bantu derived in terms of haplotype. And so again, this sort of flies in the face of that whole idea of individuals coming from the west coast of Africa. This also brings into question this whole idea of a right to return to places on the west coast of Africa when it's highly likely that individuals did not come from the west coast of Africa in many instances. And here the authors also note that there is a relatively high prevalence of lupus for individuals in Jamaica. And here you see a map with these arrows suggesting the movement of people from Western Africa into the United States and into the Americas. The problem is, as we pointed out before, that the individuals who are situated on the west coast of Africa now have not always been there in terms of that whole collective. And the individuals who were historically there have been moved over into the eastern portions of Africa and into the southern portions of Africa. So there was a removal process very much like the Indian removal process, and there was also heavy enslavement going on of those same individuals. And so it stands to reason that you would have these genetic discrepancies going on and some differences in terms of health and health outcomes and vulnerability to certain health outcomes. And here you see a discussion about individuals who were enslaved in Africa and that they brought with them very distinct African cultures, unique languages, and genetics to the New World. And these genetics are what we are dealing with at this point in time. So there has always been this assumption that individuals coming from the ports along West Africa were actually from those places. And so individuals coming from the slave coast, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Ghana, those areas, there was that assumption that those were the people coming from those specific areas. But what you see now is that that is not necessarily the case. And so the authors point that out here because they identify the fact that a port of origin designated in shipping records does not necessarily mean that that's the place that the individuals came from. It just might be that that's the area that received the enslaved individuals for export to other areas. So a person can be transported out of Ghana, but that doesn't mean that the person came from Ghana. The authors also point out that individuals who were selected for enslavement were probably not selected randomly. And they also indicate that there are some genetic tests that could be done in order to better identify the ethnic origins of individuals, but they have stated that this would be an immense undertaking, a very expensive undertaking. And again, here, as we look at this map, you can see how the Bantu migration and removal took place. So you can see how they were coming from the north and the west and then pushed into the south and into the east. And interestingly, again, this whole process culminated at around 1500, and that coincides, of course, with individuals being pushed out of Europe into the west coast of Africa. Another thing that complicates this entire history in trying to understand this genetic variance is that you also have individuals coming from Europe into the Americas and into the same ports, those Carolina ports, those southeastern ports. And so you may also have a dynamic where some of this genetic dynamic is actually coming out of Europe and not necessarily only coming out of Africa. And it's also possible that what's going on in South Africa is also related to some of the European migration, because individuals were also convicted of treason and shipped off to South Africa. One of the things that researchers need to focus on is not only the numbers, but why these numbers are so high in certain places. What are the genetic histories of these individuals, and are there any correlations between the genetic histories of different groups of people who have relatively high numbers or relatively low numbers? As we wrap up, we can see that there are a number of issues going on, not just kinesthetic intelligence similarities, but also cultural and genetic histories that might be shared between individuals who ended up in the Americas and individuals who ended up in South Africa. These similarities between South Africa and the United States really warrant further explanation. One of the reasons is that there have been a number of health disparities that have been related to both of these populations. You also have disparities in terms of the way that the people have been treated in these particular spaces. And so historically, you have processes, socio-political processes going on in South Africa that were very similar to the socio-political processes that were going on in the Americas. And you also have a dynamic of the Iberians being heavily involved in the slavery and removal of both groups of people. And so this is something that really needs to be considered in terms of better understanding health outcomes, better understanding shared cultures, better understanding the historical experiences of these groups of people. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.